Hi there. So I'm just going to go through a few books that I've been reading. Well, most I've read all of, some I'm halfway through, and one I haven't started yet, although I've been meaning to read it for a long time. Actually, it's quite a wide range for me, given that I've actually been reading an enormous amount of neuroscience. There's actually only one neuroscience book there, and that is actually feels like a very different approach to the brain compared to actually a lot of standard books I've been reading. But anyway, let's get it on. First, I want to start with this Freud, an intellectual biography by Joel Whitebrook. He is a professor at at Columbia University, New York. I'm only probably a quarter of the way through it, but I have to say right now, this is the best biography of ideas I have ever read. I've read, Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, Rilke, whatever, in a sense, there's a difficulty between a biography and a biography of ideas. A biography essentially contains too much kind of minutiae of people's lives, travelling back and forward, especially sort of late 19th century, 20th century, and biography of ideas can often be somewhat too desiccated. But this absolutely, it vibrates or kind of oscillates between the man and his ideas. So quickly, they are always feel like one at the same time. And as people will know if they've watched the channel, I have real ambivalence towards Freud. I recognise him as a towering figure of the late Enlightenment, of which this guy calls Freud as part of what is the kind of the dark Enlightenment. Actually, that's sort of an Enlightenment that wasn't leading towards a kind of perfectionism of man. I'm not sure I entirely agree with that, but towering figure nonetheless. I still feel that he was making intellectual leaps that were speculative, but he was claiming rigorous scientific empiricism, and therefore they were fraudulent. Now, this is incredibly balanced, and it was written this century, so it's incredibly balanced biography. But it's just brilliant, and I'm completely gripped page by page by page. So anyone wants to read anything about Freud, I can't recommend this highly enough. Next, a very different book. This is called Wrestliana by Toby Litt. It's published by Gally Beggar. Toby is an acquaintance of mine. He's written a lot of novels, a few of which I've read. This is a memoir, so to speak. Toby Litt's great-great-great-great-grandfather was a Cumberland and Westmoreland sort of bare-chested wrestler. And what Toby does in this book is he sort of... I'll just put it down. He talks about his own family, his own writing, and his own sense of manhood and fatherhood, and juxtaposes it with this extraordinary fellow from the early 18th century who lived in Cumbria and was this wrestler, and a wrestler, novelist, poet, journalist, and it's about identity, it's about manhood, and it's also about how he discovers and how Toby chooses to peel back certain layers of his father, of his great grandfather William Litt's life. And it's an incredibly gentle, warm, comforting read. In a sense, it's not and most books to create drama and tension or whatever have to have kind of edge and angles. But this isn't. This is a sort of honest book about family, and he obviously has a wonderful relationship with his parents, and it's his father that pushes him to write this book. And there is there is tension and tension and sort of what would it be that he's having to wrestle with his obviously wrestle with his father, because actually he wants to be a novelist and write novels, and his father wants to do this, and his mother's just died, and it's meaningful for his father. All of this is there, but it's always done with an enormous amount of love, and I was absolutely gripped, and I think it's a really beautiful and rich and warm and human book, and better than almost any other memoir I've read. And I don't read many memoirs. It's not mawkish or sentimental, but it's still warm and loving. The Seventh Function of Language by Laurent Binet. I read his extraordinary HHHH a couple of years ago, and this is a sort of fictional meta-narrative about Roland Barthes and his death. But I haven't read any of it, but I look forward to it. This is a terrible cover and a terrible title, How Emotions Are Made, The Secret Life of the Brain, by Lisa Feldman Barrett. She is, it should be said, a university distinguished professor of psychology at Northeastern University, with appointments at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital in psychiatry and radiology. So she is an academic and a clinician. And this absolutely reframes how one should consider our emotional responses to life, and that it overturns about 50 years of what are called sort of the Ekman classic model of emotional fingerprinting. That there are kind of 6 globalized emotions for which the entire population of the world are kind of built up from, and you can recognise them across the world. And that there is, not only are there fingerprints for emotions, there are sort of very specific and discrete locations for these emotions in the brain. Absolutely turns this on its head, and essentially says emotions are constructed through our conceptual understanding of the world, and the fact that we need that emotions are incredibly finely sliced. They are dispersed completely throughout the brain. So a single emotion is called degeneracy in the brain. Right? It's a many-to-one system. So our emotions a single emotion will come from many parts of the brain, and that it is only when we experience the world, or experience ourselves in the world, and an emotion is named, that we actually can put these two things together, and therefore both recognize it in ourselves as a emotion and in other people. And it is extraordinary. And if anyone is interested in why we feel things the way we do, why there is it's often a disconnect between when someone says something about how they feel and we think they feel and we feel and whatever. It's about misconceptualizations or a lack of proper mapping of conceptual emotions. But actually, it's the fact that through language and discourse, we will be able to come up with a way of explaining how people feel on a much more specific and subtle level, rather than just like, he's feeling angry, she's feeling sad. That's an emotion of disgust. It's that we are hugely emotionally intelligent, potentially intelligent creatures. And the reason we are is because of this conceptualization of constructed emotions. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant, but terrible cover, terrible name. A novel, The Great Concert of the Night by Jonathan Buckley, published by Sort of Books. This is fascinating, actually. It's a very English novel that reads like European cinema. The main character is a curator of a kind of private museum of curiosities, and he meets an English actress who spends her time acting in French films, and it plays its kind of eroticism very delicately and very subtly, and actually it's a novel of atmospheres, and sort of I don't know how to describe it. One feels as though the sort of lens is always very, very close, but also slightly hazy at the same time. I mean, it was sent as a proof, and I said that there is something about it that reminds me of James Salter, which is very exalted praise, because I think he's the finest sentence maker in English, and Jonathan Buckley isn't as good as James Salter, but there is something about that kind of shimmeringness that James Salter had, and a lack of sort of ABCD narrative, a sort of. But it's and I in the end I really enjoyed it, and felt that it was doing something very unusual, which kind of English novels tend not to do. So it's weird. Something about it is very English, something about it is very European, and they intersect, and he makes them intersect, and that makes for a very unusual and involving and enriching read. And it is, once again, very unsentimental. Although the setup right at the beginning, you could be forgiven thinking, I think I know where this is going to go, and it's going to be a little bit in love with its sort of kind of the French feminine muse type of character, but it's much cleverer and grown up than that. The Crossway by Guy Stagg. This is a proof copy. This is a non-fiction book. Guy Stagg he's in his mid-20s, probably late 20s now, who was suffering from profound depression. I mean, suicidal depression in London, and the decision he makes is to make a pilgrimage from London to Jerusalem. And I won't be right to say that he's an atheist, although he sort of self-identifies as not being a believer or a Christian. But he takes this decision to walk, and it is extraordinary, and in this way he tries to deal with his wounds, his psychological wounds, to cure himself, and it's a story of encounters of people, of the difficulty of a purely ambulatory solo walk, especially when he crosses the Alps. But there's wonderful moments of history about saints and pilgrims, and it's a very, once again, this is a gentle, unassuming book that is not trying to make its point, or rather, not trying to make its point, not trying to make a point that might alienate. Saying that this was my journey to sort of mental well-being, or as much as I could, and it's fascinating because of that, and it's a very brave, unusual, wonderful book. To sort of move on to slightly more depressing matters, Lawrence Rees's The Holocaust. I've read a lot about Hitler and the Second World War and the Third Reich and whatever, but I've kind of wanted to have fully in my head how it happened, who were the players both inside Germany and the players outside Germany, in terms of kind of made this almost kind of permissible through their inaction. And this is fantastically well written, very clear, very persuasive. It never fails to shock. One does not become numb by the numbers. And there's some extraordinary photographs which bring the direct human experience completely to life, if that doesn't sound trivial. But you come away from reading this book going, I know how it happened. I know what the level of kind of psychic collusion was, what the drives were. And in that way, I hope I can kind of put my own slightly obsessive purchase on why why this happened, I think I can put it to rest to a certain degree. One always has to be kind of hyper vigilant that these things can happen again, especially in this, in this the 21st century, which seems to be a return to kind of nativism, especially in Europe. But I do think I have a better purchase on how it happened. This is very interesting. This is called The Political Samaritan by Nick Spencer. It's published by Bloomsbury. It's very much a kind of United Kingdom based analysis of how politics has appropriated the parable of the Good Samaritan, and it is brilliantly engaging, and it's extraordinary the lengths to which politicians will appropriate this particular, and of course they do, because it is perfect. A man is dying at the side of the road and people walk past, they walk on by, and then a man stops and a man helps, and that is going to be appropriated by politicians. And Nick Spencer kind of unpicks that, and it's extraordinary how even Thatcher appropriate this, and essentially said, she basically went, look at the parable of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan had to have his own personal wealth in order to do this. So really, what we take out of this is, go and be wealthy, go and then you will be able to go out and help people. Actually, it is probably inexhaustible in itself, but that is not a possible reading. And I don't think for a second, anybody on the right can have that reading. You can have, the only way the right can take this reading is one of personal sovereignty. I.e., there is no ideology which is going to stop you helping this person. Whereas it seems to me that the right is full of ideology, which basically says, if we help this person, they'll all be lying on the side of the road, which is just, whatever. Whatever. But it's really, honestly, it's a fascinating, brilliant book, and whatever. And now, finally, Claude Lévi-Strauss, The Poet in the Laboratory, a biography of ideas, not as good as the Freud, but actually very, very good, on the father of structuralism. It's the French are extraordinary, and they so love their theories, and they so love the kind of they so love the sort of transports of theories that can take on everything. And it's not a kind of universalist sense, but it's that you can be a poet, a scientist, an anthropologist, a philosopher, and you can encapsulate everything in a kind of what would the word be? A kind of amorphous theory, for want of a word. I mean, what's interesting is that it seems to me that structuralism doesn't. When you read this, you don't feel structuralism was the right noun, the right label for what Lévi-Strauss was doing. It always seemed to be about relations and tensions. But you could, of course, say that if you put things in relation to each other and you create tensions, that create structures. So maybe that's it. But actually, it's the endless relations that he finds. And it talks about his mythology quartet, his 4 books about mythologies, where he's taking something up to sort of 600 Amerindian and actually global mythologies, and just looking for every single kind of moment of kind of consonance and intersectionality and whatever to create. And it's as an intellectual exercise, it seems to me what a marvelous way to spend one's life. But he did about 8 months wandering bits of Brazil, had a theory, came back and spent most of his time in the West just running with that theory. And, the Anglo-Saxon or the Anglo-American world would just never permit that. You can't just go into the field, have a inspiration, have a sort of intuition, and go and create an entire theory that's going to influence an entire generation based on that intuition. And in many ways, you've got to love the French for it, or find them deeply frustrating. I'm more of the latter. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much.